April 1986. The world didn't know it yet, but it was standing dangerously close to a catastrophe far worse than anything that had already happened. A nuclear reactor had exploded in the Soviet Union, sending invisible waves of radiation into the sky and spreading fear across an entire continent. Governments scrambled to understand what was unfolding. Officials downplayed the danger at first, while scientists quietly realized that the situation was far more serious than anyone was willing to admit publicly. Entire cities were evacuated in silence, often without people even being told the truth about why they had to leave their homes behind. But beneath the visible chaos, the burning reactor, the evacuations, the rising radiation levels, there was another threat forming. A hidden danger that was not immediately obvious but far more destructive if left unchecked. Deep below the damaged reactor, a chain of events was slowly building towards something even worse. And almost no one knew it was happening, except for a small number of engineers who understood the physics, the structure, and the terrifying possibility of what could come next. They knew that the disaster was not over. In fact, in many ways, it had only just begun. What followed was not a massive rescue mission or a coordinated operation involving hundreds of people. It came down to a single critical task, one that required someone to step forward and enter an environment where survival was uncertain. And in that moment, 3 men made a decision that would define everything that came after. The disaster that wasn't over. When reactor number 4 at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant exploded on April 26, 1986, the immediate destruction was catastrophic. The explosion tore through the reactor building, blowing apart the roof and upper structure and exposing the nuclear core directly to the open air. Graphite blocks from inside the reactor were scattered across the site, many of them still burning intensely. These fires sent thick plumes of radioactive smoke into the atmosphere, carrying contamination far beyond the plant itself. Emergency responders rushed in within minutes, many of them believing they were dealing with a standard industrial fire. They worked without full protective gear, focusing only on extinguishing the flames and preventing further visible damage, unaware that they were being exposed to extremely high levels of radiation with every passing second. But what was happening inside the reactor was far more complex and far more dangerous than what could be seen from the outside. The nuclear fuel inside the core had not simply stopped reacting after the explosion. Instead, it had undergone a transformation into a molten, highly radioactive mass. This material reached temperatures so extreme that it began to melt through everything in its path: fuel rods, metal structures, and even thick layers of concrete designed to contain it. The destruction was no longer limited to the initial blast. It had become a slow, ongoing process that was just as dangerous, if not more. Beneath the reactor were large pools of water, originally part of the plant's cooling and safety systems. These pools had filled further due to emergency firefighting efforts, broken pipes, and damaged infrastructure caused by the explosion. At first glance, the presence of water might have seemed like a helpful element, something that could cool the system or reduce the risk. But in reality, it created a far more dangerous scenario. Instead of stabilizing the situation, it introduced a new and unpredictable risk that few people fully understood at the time. Above this water sat the molten core, slowly burning its way downward through the remaining structural barriers. This substance, later known as corium, was unlike anything most engineers had ever dealt with. It was unstable, constantly changing, and capable of generating immense heat and pressure. Its movement was slow but relentless, driven by gravity and extreme temperature, making it nearly impossible to stop using conventional methods. The longer it remained active, the greater the risk it posed. What made the situation even more critical was the uncertainty. Scientists and engineers could estimate what might happen, but they could not predict the exact timing or behavior of the molten material. They knew it was moving downward, and they knew what was waiting below, but they didn't know exactly when those two would meet. The danger was no longer just the radiation that had already been released into the environment. It was what might happen next. and how quickly it could escalate beyond control. The explosion that could have changed everything. The true scale of the threat became clear when scientists and engineers began to analyze what would happen if the molten core reached the water below. If that contact occurred, it would trigger a massive steam explosion. This wasn't just a theoretical possibility. It was a highly likely outcome given the conditions inside the reactor. The intense heat of the molten material meeting the water would cause an instant and violent expansion of steam, generating an explosion powerful enough to destroy what remained of the reactor structure. But the physical destruction was only part of the concern. The real danger was the release of additional radioactive material into the atmosphere. The first explosion had already contaminated large areas. A second explosion could have multiplied that impact significantly, spreading radiation further across Eastern and Central Europe. Experts feared that entire regions could become uninhabitable for generations. Water supplies, including major rivers, could be contaminated, affecting millions of people. Agricultural land could be rendered useless, creating long-term food shortages. Cities that were still functioning could have been forced into evacuation. This was not just a continuation of the disaster. It was a scenario that could have escalated it into one of the worst environmental catastrophes in human history. The race against time. Once the risk was fully understood, the situation turned into a race against time. Every passing hour increased the likelihood that the molten core would continue its descent and eventually reach the water below. The only solution was to remove the water before that could happen. But this was far easier said than done. The drainage system was controlled by valves located deep within the plant, in areas that were now flooded and highly radioactive. To reach these valves, someone would have to enter the lower levels of the facility, an environment that was not only physically dangerous but also filled with radiation levels that could not be precisely measured at the time. Protective equipment was limited, and there was no guarantee it would provide sufficient protection. The path to the valves was not straightforward. It required navigating through complex corridors, dealing with rising water levels, and operating in near-total darkness. Communication with the outside was limited, and once inside, the individuals would be largely on their own. This was not just a technical task. It was a mission that required someone to accept the possibility that they might not come back. And yet, it had to be done. The three men who stepped forward. In a situation where hesitation could have had devastating consequences, three men stepped forward to take on the mission. Alexei Ananenko, a nuclear engineer, had detailed knowledge of the plant's design. He understood exactly where the valves were located and how to reach them. Without his expertise, the mission would have been nearly impossible. Valery Bezpalov, another engineer, brought technical skill and experience, helping ensure that once the valves were found, they could be operated correctly. Boris Baranov, a senior technician, provided additional support, familiar with the plant's systems and capable of assisting under pressure. These men were not chosen randomly. They volunteered because they understood the situation better than most. They knew the risk, but they also knew the consequences of doing nothing. They were not acting out of recklessness or blind courage. Their decision was based on understanding, an awareness that their actions could prevent something far worse. In that moment, they faced a choice that very few people ever have to make, and they chose to go forward. Into the darkness. Equipped with basic protective suits and handheld flashlights, the three men began their descent into the lower levels of the reactor building. The moment they crossed into that space, everything changed. The air felt heavier, the silence more intense, and the reality of where they were became impossible to ignore. This wasn't just another part of the facility anymore. It was the heart of a disaster zone, a place where every step carried risk. The corridors were partially flooded with contaminated water rising around their legs as they moved forward. Each step had to be taken carefully. The floor was uneven, slippery, and filled with debris from the explosion above. The water itself was not just an obstacle, it was a constant reminder of the danger surrounding them. They knew it carried radioactive particles, and every moment spent in contact with it increased their exposure. As they went deeper, the darkness became more overwhelming. The facility had lost power, leaving most areas in near total blackness. Their flashlights cut through the darkness in narrow beams, barely illuminating what was ahead. Shadows stretched across the walls, and every movement created uncertainty. It was not just physically challenging, it was mentally exhausting. At times, they had to rely on memory rather than sight. Alexei Ananenko's knowledge of the plant layout became critical. Without it, navigating those corridors would have been nearly impossible. Even with that knowledge, everything felt unfamiliar. The environment had changed. Landmarks were harder to recognize. The explosion had altered the structure in ways that made orientation difficult. The deeper they moved, the more the pressure built, not just from the environment, but from the awareness of time. They knew why they were there. They knew what would happen if they didn't know what condition they would be in by the time they completed the mission. And yet, they kept moving. Step by step, deeper into the darkness, the moment that saved millions. With the valves finally located, the three men began the process of opening them. This was the most critical phase of the mission, the point where their efforts would either succeed or fail. The mechanisms were not easy to operate, especially under such conditions. Their hands, already affected by the cold water and stress, had to work precisely despite fatigue and limited visibility. As the valves turned and the system began to respond, the water slowly started to drain. At first, there was no immediate sign of success, only the hope that the system was working as intended. But gradually it became clear that the operation was successful. The water level began to drop, reducing the risk of the molten core reaching it. In that moment, the immediate threat of a catastrophic steam explosion was prevented. The chain reaction that could have escalated the disaster to unimaginable levels was effectively stopped. What makes this moment so powerful is that it happened quietly. There were no celebrations, no dramatic announcements, just three men standing in a dark, flooded space, having completed a task that would go on to protect millions of lives. The aftermath and reality. In the years that followed, the story of these three men became surrounded by myths and misunderstandings. Many people believed that they had died shortly after completing their mission, assuming that the level of radiation they were exposed to would have been fatal. This version of the story spread widely, reinforcing the idea that their actions were a direct and immediate sacrifice. However, the reality was more nuanced. The three men survived the mission itself. They lived on, though like many others involved in the Chernobyl cleanup, they faced long-term health risks due to their exposure. Radiation does not always have immediate effects. It can take years to fully reveal its impact. Their survival does not lessen what they did. At the time, they had no guarantee of making it out safely. The story is not just about sacrifice. It's about facing uncertainty and choosing to act anyway. Why their decision matters. What makes their decision so important is not just the scale of the danger they prevented, but the nature of the choice itself. They were not forced into the situation. They were not acting under direct orders that removed their ability to decide. They stepped forward because they understood what was at stake. In many large-scale disasters, we often focus on systems, failures, and outcomes. But behind those systems are individuals who make critical decisions in moments of uncertainty. These decisions are not always visible, and they are not always recognized, but they are often the turning points that shape what happens next. The three men at Chernobyl represent that turning point. Their actions demonstrate how a small number of people, with the right knowledge and the willingness to act, can influence events on a massive scale. It's a reminder that even in situations where everything seems out of control, individual choices still matter, and sometimes those choices carry consequences far beyond what anyone can fully comprehend in the moment. When we look back at disasters like Chernobyl, it's easy to focus on the explosion, the destruction, and the long-term consequences. Those are the visible parts of the story, the parts that make headlines and are remembered in history. But what often goes unnoticed are the moments in between, where the outcome could have shifted in a completely different direction. This was one of those moments, a moment where the disaster could have become far worse, where the damage could have spread even further, affecting millions more lives. And in that moment, the difference was made not by large organizations or complex systems, but by three individuals willing to step into an unknown and dangerous situation. Their actions didn't erase the tragedy of Chernobyl, but they prevented it from becoming something even more devastating. And that is what makes their story so important. It's not just about what happened, it's about what didn't happen because of them. Because sometimes the biggest impact isn't seen in what occurs, but in what is quietly avoided. And in this case, what was avoided was a disaster on a scale the world may never fully understand.